So last year I made a video entitled "What if every team drafted best player available?" I used the PFF mock draft simulator and basically just went down the line. So whoever had the first overall pick picked whoever was ranked first overall according to their big board and just went from 1 to 32, paying no attention to positional need or anything like that, just as a fun exercise. I figured a year removed now, what if we go back, look at what ended up happening, who was selected with that best player available draft, and would teams be better off having done that, just drafting best player available, or was drafting for need the right idea in some of these scenarios? Well, let's just get into it. So, all right, I'm not going to listen to what I had to say here. I'm just going to go through the list and see, where things ended up. So it's a little bit blurry. Maybe I can see if I can get the quality a little better on the screen. But, first overall, they had Aiden Hutchinson, and then number 2 was actually Kyle Hamilton, interestingly enough. I do think the Jaguars would have been better off with Hutchinson than Walker, given how Walker played his first year, but there's still time, of course, with Walker. Hamilton's an interesting one with the Lions. Again, I think they'd rather have Hutchinson, but if he was off the board, Hamilton ended up playing really well as a rookie. That wouldn't have been a terrible selection necessarily, even though, I was lower on Hamilton coming out of the draft. I was wrong about that. The Texans ended up with Derek Stingley, so nothing has changed there. We didn't have, Kayvon Thibodeau goes at number 4. So again, I think they were happier with Sauce Gardner, which I don't know if it was a position of need. I actually don't think it was. I think they truly picked who they felt was best player available. It just happened to be different than who PFF felt was best player available. With the Giants, though, getting Charles Cross, again, they ended up with Thibodeau here because Thibodeau is now off the board. They go with Charles Cross, who, I think could have definitely, helped them out. Obviously, they still got a tackle. They got their favorite tackle. But so far, nothing too wild, I think. The Panthers still end up with Akeem Ikwonu here, so they're completely unchanged. Moving on down the list to the Giants, and this is where things would have been interesting because they would have had 2 tackles, even though they already have Andrew Thomas. But could Evan Neal have transitioned to a guard or something? Possibly. I mean, while it seems like this would be a bad scenario for the Giants, obviously losing Thibodeau hurts, but what can you do? He was drafted before you. It's just an interesting scenario, but they probably could have still made this work. And given that Neal had a rough rookie year, kind of both of these guys did, maybe you wouldn't hate having both of them at this point, but obviously you'd rather have Thibodeau. All right, moving on here, the Atlanta Falcons, who were pick number 8. Let's see if I can find a clear screenshot. Here we go. They went with Trent McDuffie. I did not realize Trent McDuffie was so high up on the list there. But you know what? I like Trent McDuffie a lot. I think he's a very good player. So would he have helped the Falcons more than Drake London? Probably not. Again, kind of interestingly, the regular draft still was better than than this draft, although part of me wonders how much of it has to come down to the PFF big board is different than the consensus big board. I wonder if we went with the consensus big board, would it be different? But the Seahawks at 9, going after Sauce Gardner, obviously they'd be thrilled about that. Sauce Gardner ended up going earlier in the real draft. They never had this option, but they would have loved that to happen. And then the Jets. So in this scenario, the Jets double up on defensive linemen. And if you're not going to get Sauce Gardner, who, again, I think was just a better player, I had him as number 2 of my overall prospects, so I would have had him earlier. But if you're not going to get him, again, having doubling up on the edge rusher wouldn't be a terrible thing. I think those are 2 good players. So moving on now, we have Drake London going at 11 to Washington. Washington ended up trading down in the real draft and selecting Jahan Dotson, but, I think they would like to have, I think they're happy with what they have, but I think Drake London did have the better rookie year, so I don't think that's crazy necessarily. Garrett Wilson at number 12, the Vikings traded down to the Lions, who selected Jameson Williams at number 12, but PFF liked Wilson better. Still feels like, that's kind of to be determined given, we don't know where Jameson Williams will be at the end of his career. Moving on to number 13, that was Bernard Rainman. I think people forget how hyped up Bernard Rainman was in this draft. He was very, hyped up. Ended up going in the 3rd round, but played really well for the Colts. This would have been a better draft pick than what the Texans ended up doing, getting a guard who did not play particularly well year 1. They traded back a couple spots, but still, this is something that I think that, if you're a Texans fan, at the time might have seemed a little crazy, but in hindsight, actually was probably the right move. So next up at 14, the Ravens, who would have had Kyle Hamilton, who they're very happy with, but in this situation, they end up with Trayvon Walker, which compared to the rest of the board, again, not a huge Trayvon Walker fan, but in the mid first round pick, this might have been worth. I feel better suited for where he what his value was personally, because again, there still is some hope. The Eagles having Devin Lloyd, again, could have really helped. I think they feel fine with Jordan Davis. They kind of drafted, not really for need, but for a need that they wanted. But what's interesting here is it almost feels like this would have helped out a need potentially more, because now they lost all of their linebackers, and they still are okay on the defensive line. So at this point, having a linebacker was kind of more of a need pick than one they ended up going with. Moving on down the list, you have Jamison Williams going to the Saints, which again, they are very happy with Chris Olave, who they traded up to make sure that they drafted. But again, given the board, I don't think this would have been a terrible pick necessarily. And the Chargers end up with Devontae Wyatt here, who did not have a great rookie year, but still, I think I would be interested in what he can do in the future, and it would be interesting to see, him on that defensive line with some really good edge rushers around him. Maybe that would have helped. Now, interestingly, here at number 18, you have Nakobe Dean going to the Philadelphia Eagles. Nakobe Dean ended up going to the Philadelphia Eagles, but remember, he fell all the way to the third round, I believe, interestingly enough. That was a surprise. But Nakobe Dean to the Eagles, again, we'll see how it works out, but they end up doubling up on linebacker here, which, again, would have seemed crazy, right? They already have two good linebackers, but this is kind of a good example of maybe, unless you're trying to compete for a championship right now, maybe you don't have to solely pick based on need, because a situation that seems insane, the Eagles drafting multiple linebackers when they already have multiple good linebackers. In a situation like this, these would be their two starting linebackers. So it's kind of a good example of why drafting for need, sometimes avoiding that, can still make sense, even if you have, good players at that position. It doesn't feel like it's the smartest move. Tyler Linderbaum for the Saints, again, another example of maybe wouldn't have been the biggest need, but I think he could have played very well for the New Orleans Saints. Moving on to number 20, they get Jordan Davis. So again, very happy with Kenny Pickett. The quarterback situation kind of always just makes things odd, as quarterbacks matter so much. If you can get a quarterback, get that. They're happy with Pickett. But if you're not going to go Pickett, down the list, he might have been the right option. Number 21, the New England Patriots here would have gotten Chris Olave. They would have been very thrilled with that. They ended up trading down and then selecting Cole Strange, which was an odd pick. Certainly, I think they would rather have Chris Olave. If he was available, they would have been thrilled with that. The Packers, hilariously, in this situation, went with a quarterback in the first round, which is just fantastic. But again, as crazy as that seems, I think Rodgers' head would have exploded. They couldn't have done it. But on paper, having Sam Howell now would not be the worst thing in the world, and probably would be better than having Quay Walker now, wouldn't it? I mean, actually, I believe that was Devontae Wyatt who was picked 22nd. But either way, I think that given the fact that you have Jordan Love, who you like, but having a plan B at the quarterback position would not have been the worst thing in the world. Although, again, Sam Howell was not worth a first-round pick. So, really, it wouldn't have been a great pick just because he's not really the 22nd prospect on the board. PFF just had him there. But interesting stuff there. The Cardinals, they could use a lot. So they had a lot of needs. Not as much last year, but still a good amount. But going after Trevor Penning, again, with the players still on the board, a couple players that maybe they would like to have better, but nothing really major that they feel like they're losing here. And same thing with the Cowboys going after David Ajabo. Now, they ended up reaching on tackle who ended up being very good for them as a rookie, so they feel okay about where they're at. But still, just an interesting pick there. And then we have one that, okay, again, a lot of these are just sort of fascinating, but some of these are legitimately this would just not make sense, really, would be the Bills drafting Malik Willis. That's kind of the one, there's a couple, but this is the one where it's you probably have to take positional value into account at some point here. And I think with quarterbacks, it makes sense. And also, if you're trying to compete right now, those tend to be the two instances where drafting for need instead of just drafting best player available probably makes a bit more sense. Next up on the list at 26, the team that drafted Malik Willis, not in this round, but later on, they're going to get Jermaine Johnson here, who I think they would feel pretty good about. Johnson, he didn't play a lot last year, but looked solid in the snaps that he did have. He ended up going to the Jets. So, okay, this feels like a solid pick here, I would say. You then have the Buccaneers going with Andrew Booth Jr. They ended up trading back. And again, this is another interesting one where it's like, okay, did they need a corner last year? No. And I would still probably say the right process was to trade back and then get players who were going to help them right away. But in this situation now, having another corner in the room might not be the worst thing in the world when you lost Sean Murphy-Bunting. So moving down the list, the Packers go with Lewis Seen here. Again, they in the real draft ended up with Quay Walker. I would have rather, Lewis Seen, we haven't seen him play. He didn't play a single snap last year, but still feels like I would rather have him than Quay Walker. That's just kind of where I'm sitting as of right now. You then have the Chiefs who picked 29, originally were scheduled to pick 29 and 30. They got Kaiir Elam and Jalen Petir, who would have been two very good pieces for them, I think. Again, Chiefs made out like bandits in this draft, but still was a very interesting, that would have been a very interesting move by them. We didn't have the Bengals, so the Bengals would end up with Treylon Burks, which again is another one of these positional need, you do not need it, and I don't know how much he would have helped them. So, okay, there are some examples too, we're learning, of drafting for just purely based on best player available, paying attention to nothing does not make sense. Although I think we're also learning those aren't as often as you would expect. And same thing with Zion Johnson to the Lions. Is that what they need? No. But could he have been a contributor for them? I think so, even though they have an incredible offensive line, although probably it makes some sense in those scenarios to go somewhere else. So what have we learned from this exercise? Well, some of these picks didn't really tell us much. Some of them were just kind of interesting and fun. I think what we learned from this exercise is that, for the most part, you do tend to get a better player when you draft best player available. That part is true. Also, maybe PFF, they're very good at some of this stuff, maybe not perfect at all of it, is, I think, reasonable to say. I would also say that the quarterback situation in general, if you have a star quarterback, you obviously don't need to go after another quarterback. You could, maybe if you don't feel like you have a superstar quarterback, you could consider it, because there are examples where it could make sense. But as a whole, I would probably say if you feel great about a position, then I wouldn't keep drafting at that position. But that's kind of the only thing I would do. If you feel okay about a position, I think it's fine to still draft at that position. What you don't want to do is look at what you're worst at and then draft a player that plays that position solely, because you could be missing out on a significantly better player by doing so. But, it's just an interesting kind of exercise. So yeah, that's what I think of all this. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.